Psalm 81 could possibly be seen as a response to Psalm 80. Psalm 80 was a prayer for restoration, and Psalm 81 is a festival song where God answers back. The bulk of this psalm is actually God speaking to his people through the priest. This psalm was likely used for festival occasions, perhaps the Feast of Tabernacles, which was one of the three harvest festivals, Tabernacles being in the fall. While it is a festival song and it starts off very similar to Psalm 65 and other songs of thanksgiving, it quickly moves to a psalm that focuses on teaching as God speaks to his people, echoing many of the words of Moses from Deuteronomy 32 and the Song of Moses. So you can see the psalm has a connection to some kind of feast day. In verse 3, it mentions the new moon, which that was the signal for the feast. They were based on a lunar calendar, and so that's why we suggest that this is a feast day song, probably for the Festival of Tabernacles. The song begins very, very hymn-like with a call to worship, to sing aloud, to sing for joy, to raise a song, sound the tambourine, the lyre, the harp. So instrumental music and singing are enjoined. The next verses suggest the connection to a feast, essentially saying, keep the feast. This is a statute. This is a rule, a decree. And notice the reference to Egypt. We'll go there again in the remainder of the psalm. But these festivals reminded them of their past. And of course, one of the most significant events of their past was the Exodus from Egypt. So that is rehearsed a bit here. And so we begin with the first 5 verses suggesting a call to worship for a festival. But then God speaks, and the rest of the psalm becomes an oracle, the words of God spoken through the Levite to his people. And he takes them back to that time they were in Egypt. He says, I relieved your shoulder of the burden, that is the burden of slavery. Your hands were freed from the basket. In distress you called, and I delivered. I answered you in the secret place of thunder, tested you at the waters of Meribah. So this is all relating not only to the Exodus, but to the wilderness wanderings, the waters at Meribah, recognized there. As the psalm moves forward, it takes us back to the Shema. Hear, O my people. Hear, O Israel. The Shema is located in Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5, and it is the summary statement of faith, that the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And so that's what these verses remind us. I am the Lord your God who brought you up from the land of Egypt. This is Yahweh's identity. An emphasis in this section of the psalm will be on listening to God. 3 times there will be this reference to listening. O Israel, if you would just listen to me. And the promise is, if you would listen to me, if you would open wide your mouth, I will fill it. I will satisfy you. You have been looking for satisfaction in other things, but if you will simply open your mouth and listen to me, hear from me, listen to my words and obey them, I will satisfy you. And the key word for this psalm I've identified as honey, coming from this final verse. He would feed you. If you open your mouth, he will feed you with the finest of wheat, with honey from the rock. I would satisfy you. A reference to the fact that honey in those days would have been found in the rocks, in the rocky crags, where bees would build their nests in the wild and then would be harvested. I assume at great cost to the harvester. It certainly wasn't like modern honey processing today in nice boxes that we can move around. This would have been a real treat, I think, to have some honey. And so when God says, I'll give you honey, that's just the finest of things, the finest of wheat, the sweetest of things. That would be honey from the rock. It's really important to take this psalm and lay it out next to the Song of Moses, Deuteronomy 32. Moses only has one psalm that made the Psalter, Psalm 90. But we could just as well put Deuteronomy 32 there. It's called the Song of Moses, and you'll recognize in this psalm many references that we've seen in the psalm previously. Kept him as the apple of his eye, that's Psalm 17. And then we have the reference to Psalm 81 here. He suckled him with honey out of the rock, the very finest of wheat. So this is the promise. This is the statement that that God would care for his people. Notice the reference in verse 11, like an eagle that stirs up its nest, flutters over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them, bearing them on its pinions. Reminder, Psalm 91 has some of that language. We've seen that elsewhere throughout the Psalms, that we rest in the shadow of his wings, and that initial image then comes from this Deuteronomy 32. So I wanted to bring that into this psalm as well and make that connection for you, that certainly the psalmist Asaph here is wanting the people to reflect back on Deuteronomy 32. As Moses gives his final address, he teaches them this song before he will pass on and before the people pass into the promised land, giving them as final words of instruction and reminders that God wants to satisfy and can satisfy our needs if we will simply listen to him, open wide our mouths to receive what he has to give us.